Life Stories is where we share the most powerful and emotional journeys. The kind that change us forever. Today, we bring you a tale of hidden success, family secrets, and the courage it takes to step into the light. Meet Megan, a woman who quietly built an empire while hiding her accomplishments from her family, only to have the truth come crashing down in the most unexpected way. It's a story of revelation, betrayal, and ultimately, self-discovery. Join us as we dive into this incredible life story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin the story today. I've always been someone who quietly observed, who held my thoughts and ambitions close to my chest, especially when it came to family. At 34, I had built something that most people would consider a dream, a real estate empire spanning half of the city. I owned properties everywhere, from small apartments to luxurious complexes, and everything I touched seemed to flourish. But none of this was known to my family. To them, I was Megan, just Ethan's wife, a woman who did something with apartments. It was infuriating, but I had learned long ago to bear it in silence. No one in my family ever took me seriously. Dinner at my mother's house had always been an ordeal. The unspoken rules were simple: arrive on time, smile, nod, and, above all, do not speak up. There would be enough passive-aggressive comments and backhanded compliments to fill an entire evening. But it was best to say nothing and let it pass. The more I kept my true self hidden, the easier it was to manage the expectations of those around me. I stared at my phone one evening, reading the message from my mother for the 10th time. Family dinner tonight. Don't be late. I sighed and placed the phone down. A tight knot formed in my stomach. And for a moment, I wondered why I even bothered anymore. Why did I go to these dinners, year after year, knowing full well that no matter what I did or achieved, it would never be enough for them? I had built an empire, for heaven's sake, and yet all they saw me as was someone who couldn't measure up. You're thinking about dinner again, aren't you? Audrey, my business partner and friend, waved her hand in front of my face, pulling me out of my spiral. I blinked and looked up at her, forcing a smile. How can I not? It's the same thing every time, I muttered, pushing my salad around on my plate. The conversation turned to my work, but I could tell she knew where my mind was. You could always tell them, Audrey suggested, raising an eyebrow. About owning the building, about everything. Just give up the piece of being underestimated. I forced a laugh. It was a nice thought, but it wasn't that simple. The piece I had was the only thing I could control. Besides, it was better this way, keeping a low profile. There was something oddly satisfying about watching them live in my buildings without knowing the truth. They all rented from me. Barbara, my mother, Tara, my sister-in-law, and even Greg, my brother-in-law, all lived in apartments I owned. They didn't have a clue that their rent checks went straight into my company's account. Why do you let them live in your buildings? Audrey asked, her voice cutting through my thoughts. I rolled my eyes. Because I'm a masochist. I sighed. Actually, it was Ethan's idea. He thought it would help everyone stay close. If only he knew the truth. The truth was that I had built my real estate empire slowly over the last decade. One small property at a time. One smart investment after another. Until I found myself owning half the residential blocks in the area. But the crown jewel of it all was the luxury apartment complex. The Pinnacle Apartments, where my mother and in-laws lived. They were blissfully unaware of the fact that I owned the very place they called home. I kept this secret because, honestly, it was easier. No one questioned my financial decisions. No one pried into my business. I could maintain my peace, my independence, and my sense of control. Audrey could see that I was lost in thought, so she changed the subject. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and property inspections. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. By the time I stood outside my mother's apartment, my apartment. Technically, I was already dreading the evening. Ethan showed up just in time. His fresh-from-work energy a contrast to my growing anxiety. You okay? He asked as I smoothed down my black dress. His concern was genuine, and for a moment, I felt grateful for his unwavering support. Even though he didn't know the full extent of my success. We had kept our finances separate. a mutual agreement we'd made years ago. And he never questioned the lifestyle I could afford. "Ready?" he asked, pressing the doorbell. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, trying to sound confident, though my heart was racing. The door swung open to reveal Barbara, my mother, looking impeccably put together. As usual, she never seemed to tire of presenting herself as the queen of the family. "Finally, everyone's been waiting," she said with that familiar sharpness in her voice. Dinner started with the usual pleasantries, but I could feel the tension building as Greg made his first jab. "Hey, Megan, rough day at the office?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I could feel my blood begin to boil. But before I could respond, my mother cut me off. "Megan, dear, you really should do something about those dark circles. Working so hard at your age will only lead to wrinkles." I could feel my cheeks flush with embarrassment. But there was no way I was going to let her see how much it hurt. Instead, I plastered a smile on my face and excused myself to the kitchen to help Tara with the dishes. As I grabbed a dish towel, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Audrey. "Just checking in. How's dinner going?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. If only they knew. If only they realized that the very building they lived in, the one they complained about constantly, was part of my master plan. Barbara would never know that I had approved the massive renovations to the electrical systems. She didn't know that I was the one making these changes to improve the place, to elevate it. She thought the building's maintenance was just another thing to complain about. But tonight, I knew it wasn't the time to reveal anything. Or so I thought. Dinner went as expected, with every comment from Barbara digging deeper into my skin. The more she spoke, the more it felt like the weight of all her expectations and criticisms was suffocating me. The jabs about my career, how I barely knew anything about real estate, how I just handled paperwork, kept coming, each one sharper than the last. Greg chimed in with his own passive-aggressive remarks, trying to throw me off balance by suggesting that I needed a real job, just like everyone else in the family. I felt my teeth grit, but I said nothing. Ethan sat beside me, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. But like always, he didn't intervene. He knew better than to challenge my family. And I respected him for that. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the situation I had allowed myself to be in. Angry that I had built my success in silence, hidden from those who should have been the first to support me. But I'd chosen this path, hadn't I? For years, I had kept my distance, fed my family the story they wanted to hear. And it had worked, until now. But tonight, something felt different. I could sense it, deep within me, as if the dam that had held everything back was slowly starting to crack. Barbara was relentless as always. Her commentary on Ethan's success, his promotion at the firm, making me feel smaller and smaller. And yet, I stayed silent, the old habit that I could never seem to break. It wasn't until my mother's voice rang out over the table that I realized how close I was to the edge. "Everyone, please sit down," she announced, wine glass in hand, commanding attention like she always did. "I have an announcement to make about the building management." My heart skipped a beat. What was this about? There was something in her tone, something that made my stomach churn. It was like the moment before a storm breaks, when you can feel the weight of the air pressing down on you. Barbara stood up, commanding the room. "The building management has been absolutely terrible lately," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "That's why I've started a petition to have them replaced." I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the table. The wine I had just sipped went down the wrong way, and I choked. Ethan patted my back, concerned, but I barely heard him. My mind was racing. A petition? She had no idea what she was talking about. This wasn't about poor management, it was about my recent upgrades to the building. To make it safer, better, more modern, the very things Barbara had been complaining about for months. "You've already gathered signatures from most of the residents on our floor?" Barbara continued, her voice practically singing with pride. "Karen, you'll sign too, won't you?" Karen nodded enthusiastically, but I was barely listening. The pit in my stomach had grown, and I could feel my blood pressure rising. I had been so careful to keep everything under wraps, so careful to remain the invisible owner in the background. And now, My mother was about to drag me into the spotlight. Forcing my hand, I stood up suddenly, excusing myself to the kitchen. As I made my way toward the door, I tried to breathe deeply, to calm the storm inside me. The truth was about to spill out. And once it did, there would be no going back. As I stepped into the kitchen, I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I scrolled through the messages. Audrey had texted again. "How's everything going?" I stared at the message for a moment before responding. "It's going to get interesting." I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. But in that moment, it felt like the only truth I could hold on to. I heard the voices from the dining room. The laughter, the conversations, the sound of cutlery against plates. And then, Barbara's voice, louder now, commanding attention again. "Megan," she called, "are you going to join us?" I took a deep breath. Walking back toward the dining room, Ethan was standing next to me as I walked in. His hand brushed against mine. A silent show of support. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. "Everyone, please, take your seats," Barbara continued, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she turned her attention to me. "I have something important to say." The moment had come. I wasn't ready, but I had no choice but to face it. This was my family, the people who had always undermined me. And now I was about to show them who I really was. As I stood there in the doorway, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on my chest. It felt like the room had suddenly shrunk, the walls closing in with every passing second. My family sat around the table, their eyes fixed on Barbara, who was waiting for me to take my place. Ethan's hand brushed mine again, this time with more urgency, and I could feel the tension in his touch. He knew this wasn't just another dinner. This was a turning point. Barbara's gaze shifted from Greg, who had been idly stirring his wine, to me. There was something in her eyes, glee, perhaps, satisfaction at her own power. She relished these moments of control. I could see that now, more clearly than I ever had before. "Well, Megan," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 100 unspoken judgments. "Why don't you join us? Everyone's been waiting to hear your thoughts on the building management. It's quite the situation." Her words were dripping with a thinly veiled challenge, as if daring me to object. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the pulse in my temples. I had spent years dodging these moments, dodging the need to confront the truth. But here I was, standing at the precipice, knowing that the only way forward was through the storm that would follow the truth. I walked slowly to my seat, every step feeling heavier than the last. Ethan remained by my side. But there was no comfort in his presence now. Not in this moment. Not when I was about to reveal something that would forever change how they saw me. "The petition is already well underway," Barbara continued, clearly enjoying herself. "We just need a few more signatures. We'll get rid of that awful management company and finally have the building run the way it should." I was choking on the irony of her words. The very upgrades she was complaining about, the new electrical systems, the updated amenities, were all the result of the work I had done. I had spent years quietly improving everything in the building, all without anyone knowing it was me behind the scenes. My fingers tightened around the edge of my chair, the anger inside me bubbling just below the surface. I could feel it rising, threatening to spill over. I had always been the quiet one, the one who played along with the family's expectations. But no more. I took a deep breath, looking around at the faces in front of me. Greg, with his self-satisfied smirk. Karen, her wine glass still in hand, watching the scene unfold with a bemused expression. And then there was Ethan, who was now beginning to look concerned. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know what was coming. But he knew it wasn't going to be pretty. "Actually, I have something to say." I spoke up, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Barbara paused, her eyes narrowing as she tried to figure out what I was about to do. There was a flicker of hesitation in her expression, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. "The reason the building's management has been a little off lately," I continued, "is because the owner has been making some improvements, upgrading the electrical systems, getting the building up to code. You see, I'm the owner." The room fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint sound of a clock ticking in the background. I could feel all eyes on me, disbelief in the air, as if the very words I had just spoken were impossible to comprehend. Barbara's face shifted through several expressions, from confusion to shock, before settling on something that could only be described as disbelief. You, what? Greg's voice was thick with confusion. What are you talking about? I own the building, I repeated, each word cutting through the tension in the room. Not just this building, but half the residential blocks in this area. The Pinnacle Apartments. All of it. It's mine. I saw Ethan flinch beside me. He hadn't known. None of them had. I had kept it from him, too. And now, everything that had been hidden was out in the open. And there was no turning back. Barbara stood up suddenly, the shock in her face replaced by a mixture of anger and disbelief. You're lying, she shouted. You're just trying to make a fool of us, aren't you? I remained seated, calm despite the storm inside me. No, Mom, I'm not lying. I pulled my phone from my purse and slid it across the table. Here's the proof. I approved the work order for the electrical upgrades 3 weeks ago. Greg grabbed the phone first, flipping through the screen, his face turning pale as he read through the documents. Karen leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she saw the truth laid out before her. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the cogs turning in their minds as they processed what I had just revealed. Barbara looked at me, then back at the documents, then back at me again. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had no response. Why didn't you tell us? Ethan finally asked, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. He looked hurt, confused. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to understand how something like this could be kept from him. It was easier this way, I admitted, the weight of the years I had spent hiding everything finally hitting me. I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to keep my independence. And it was easier to keep playing the role you all expected. Barbara shook her head, her face flushed with frustration. You should have told us, she yelled, her voice rising. You've been lying to us all these years. I stayed quiet. I didn't owe them an explanation anymore. The truth was out, and now they had to deal with it. And then, I said something I had never said before. Something that had been building up inside me for years. The only lie here is the one you've been telling yourselves. That you've had any idea who I really am. As the room remained silent, the weight of my words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. I had said it. The truth was finally out. And there was no taking it back. For the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I didn't need their approval anymore. Didn't need to hide behind their expectations. The empire I had built, the success I had quietly achieved, it was all mine. And no one could take that away from me. Ethan stood there, still processing everything, his expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. I could see the questions in his eyes. But there was nothing more I could say right now. This was something he would have to come to terms with on his own. As for Barbara, her face was a study in shock and fury. She had always prided herself on controlling everything. But now, I had shown her that control had its limits. The truth had shattered her carefully constructed world. Greg and Karen were still silent, their faces pale as they took in what had been revealed. I could see them calculating, wondering what this would mean for their own positions in the building. Their own lives. But none of that mattered anymore. I had stopped playing their game. As I stood up to leave, I felt a lightness in my chest. This wasn't the end of everything, it was just the beginning. The beginning of truly living for myself. Not for the approval of anyone else. The beginning of building something more meaningful, something real. Life has a funny way of showing you what matters. I whispered to myself as I walked toward the door. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I was going to build next. Thank you for watching this life story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos.